Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Please join me and my guests on this next interview. Ukraine's Institute of National Remembrance has announced plans to search for the remains of Polish victims from the Volhynia Massacre of 1943 to 1944. This event saw tens of thousands of Polish civilians killed by the Ukrainian Insurgent Army amidst wartime ethnic tensions. Understanding the historical roots of this tragedy involves examining the complex Ukrainian-Polish relations in Volhynia, marked by nationalism, shifting borders, and ideological conflict. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these efforts and their significance is Bohdan Nahaylo, Editor-in-Chief of the Kyiv Post. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening.
So can you help us first by understanding how this upcoming search for the victims' remains would impact political relationship between Poland and Ukraine?
Look, I'd like to add to the context you provided because it's very fairly presented but somewhat simplified. And I think the emphasis is on Volhynia, but don't forget that the ethnic cleansing on both sides, with the majority of the casualties being sustained on the Polish side, occurred not just in Volhynia, in the Helm region, in the Lviv region, in Galicia, as it was called. And look, let's put it in a broader context, just for 2 minutes, because we don't have much time, and this is a very complex subject. I mean, Ukrainian-Polish issues, problems have been there since at least Khmelnytsky, the Cossack period, etc. They were certainly there at the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you seldom mention, and I think this is one of the problems, that Poles have a short selective memory, and Ukrainians in particular have a short selective memory when it comes to history and unfavorable things. I think that a lot of Poles don't know or don't remember that one of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was for Poland's independence to be recognized by the Allies was home rule for Volhynia and Galicia. That was abandoned in 1922. And the upsurge in sort of, shall we say, radicalism at a time when some Ukrainian politicians were trying to work it out in the Soim and appealing for normalization of relations, the youth, after policies of Polonization and open colonization, as Ukrainians saw it in Volhynia and Western Ukraine, they took to radical methods, assassinating Polish opinions too, but officials, hence the Bandera movement. Now, when we get to 1943, briefly, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army had only just been formed in 1942, October-ish, that's when it thing. And you've got these unexperienced guerrilla type of warfare, untrained, certainly not thinking in terms of military discipline, whatever, being ordered to clean out the Poles because we don't want Poland remaining there. We don't want to be part of a pre-war Poland. We want an independent Ukraine, what we've fought for. This was their message. And we know what happened, tragedy, there's no excuses for it. The Ukrainians have been extremely slow in recognizing the guilt on the Ukrainian side. And this could have been averted way back under the Poroshenko leadership in 2017, 2016. But once the Polish parliament had labeled it as genocide at a time when Ukraine is fighting Russia, obviously the mood was not there to get into the substance anymore. So what is happening now is that we're returning to a missed opportunity in 2017 to be level-headed about it, but under pressure from Poland. Let me make another very important point here. In Ukraine, the Volhynia Massacre is or genocide as it's called in Poland, is hardly known. It's never emphasized, it's never mentioned. Why? Because the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, is not remembered for Volhynia massacres. It's remembered for the post-44-45 fight into the 50s against Soviet domination. And it hasn't been convenient for the Ukrainians to remember that particular ugly moment in their history. And they should should have done up till now. So perhaps this, under pressure from the Poles, but again, done not in the most tactful way. I mean, Poland is beginning to sound in the last week or two almost like Orban and Hungary saying, if you don't deal with the ethnic minority in Transcarpathia, we're not going to support you in the EU. Right. So perhaps it's the wrong tactic, but the message has got across.
Right. I was about to ask you about it as well, because we do know that Poland has been requesting Ukraine to kind of address this issue as a condition for it to kind of approve its EU accession. Do you think Ukraine would see this sort of almost like a blackmail attempt?
It will for a week or two, but look, it should have been done. I think objectively speaking, there was nothing stopping the exhumation of the bodies of the victims. But Poland and Ukraine should have cooperated on a much more practical level with historical commissions, identifying the areas where these massacres took place. We know the names of the villages and towns, and working together to find the remains and to deal with this. But I think what it requires now is not so much the Ukrainian parliament, the Ukrainian president to say, okay, enough, we have to face up to some moments in our history which we shouldn't be proud of, and we should not cover up. Just as the Poles had the courage to do in 1947, when 150,000 Ukrainians were expelled in the Akcja Wisła, as you recall, I think it was in 1990. For the first time, the Polish parliament, and then under Kwasniewski, Poland apologized for this. The Ukrainians should also find the guts to do a similar thing. Yes, President Poroshenko, more recently President Zelensky, have been with President Duda more recently to commemorate victims of the Volhynia Massacre. But it's time for Ukraine to say, look, you know, the majority were Poles, and we behaved perhaps for reasons that are understandable from the context, but certainly not excusable, and that should not be overlooked.
Right, like you mentioned, kind of explaining how it happened, why it happened, isn't a necessary an endorsement of of it happening.
Exactly.
And you also mentioned the fact that it did take a while for this exhumation to actually take place. What has been taking so long? What are some of the challenges in the way? Do you think it's more political, or are there any other reason why it's taking the amount of time it did?
The political will, as I say, partly it was the shock of the Polish Parliament in 16 going too far ahead and describing what happened as genocide. Ukrainians being so sensitive about the Holodomor as genocide, getting that equation, and suddenly they're being accused of genocide, not by the state, a Ukrainian state didn't exist at that time, but by irregulars. You know, so very uncomfortable. And the progress that was made basically collapsed in 2017, and the Institute for History at that time, for historical memory, led by right winger, currently in the Poroshenko party in parliament, Viatrovich, they basically blocked it. And they said, no, we're not ready for this, even though this was probably the most symbolically harmless thing to do to move forward on this very thorny issue.
Right, and how do you think these findings, in the near future, might shape this future historical narrative? Or do you think that reconciliation efforts between the two countries would be made?
I don't think it will make the exhumation of the bodies will make much difference. We've got an idea of the figures. You've said between 60 to 100,000 Poles. Ukrainians claim up to 25, 20,000, etc. It's not going to make a difference. But putting up monuments and clearing consciousness. I mean, look at what the Jews are doing in parts of Western Ukraine where the Holocaust took place. They're quietly but effectively restoring stones from the burial grounds, synagogues, etc. It's not done in any provocative way. It's to say, look, unfortunately, this happened here, but we're grown-ups now, historically, to face up to the realities and to say never again together, helping one another, standing shoulder to shoulder against even graver challenges today.
Great. And like you mentioned, there is a greater challenge looming on the horizon in the name of Russia. And Poland has been the staunchest supporter of Ukraine. So do you think practically the two countries will be able to come together and maybe clear this little bit of discomfort here and kind of unify once again?
I'm confident that they will, especially as Poland is going to be will have the presidency of the EU next year. It's very important for Ukraine to sustain even at that level. And thanks, Kratos, to President Duda, who said you wouldn't expect this from a conservative figure, as opposed to hearing it from a more liberal, centrist, leftist government, however you want to define them, that don't mix this into the formula for securing Ukraine's membership of the EU. So, I think it's become very politicized in Ukraine, in Poland. It's not as politicized in Ukraine. I think the emerging fear in Ukraine is that the Poles are beginning to be afraid of us as to the economic clout that Ukraine potentially could bring into the EU, and this is becoming an excuse to put the brakes on. This is what I'm hearing from a lot of people in Kyiv, that this is being used as an excuse. Whereas, the realities are, Ukraine's a big country, and even though a large part is destroyed, look, what will it mean for agriculture? What will it mean for our standing? Even British and French officials I've spoken to recently are saying this.
Definitely a lot of other factors coming into this narrative. But in the meantime, thank you so much for breaking all of that down and giving us more context to this historical pivotal moment. And thanks so much for being with us on TVP World. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.